Hey everyone, and welcome to the channel. One of my goals for 2024 was to read a little bit more sci-fi, and I started this year off with picking up Poul Anderson's Tau Zero. This is a book that I ended up being mixed to positive on. I ended up giving it a 3-star rating, and while I thought it was a interesting read, I don't know if it executed on everything I would have liked it to. I don't know if part of that is that this book is from 1970, so it is kind of more of what I would consider a classic kind of sci-fi story at this point, and I think that maybe played into some of the problems that I did have with it. But overall, this was a fun first entry into my sci-fi journey this year. So before I dive too deep into my personal likes and dislikes, let me go ahead and tell you what this book was about. We follow the crew of 25 men and 25 women on board the Lenora Christine as they go to a new star to possibly start a new colony. When the ship's near light speed drive malfunctions, we see how the crew of the ship handles knowing they will never be able to return to Earth, and time will be passing them by. Now, normally I break up my likes and dislikes, but in this book, a lot of my likes are also dislikes, so I'm gonna just kind of combine it all into one big me talking probably way too much about this book. And the first thing I will mention is the premise of this book. I thought it was really fascinating that this is a science fiction book where the science definitely plays a big role in it, but it definitely becomes a much more human story. So obviously the ship drive malfunctions and basically the crew cannot slow down. Obviously they were going near light speed, so there's some elements of time dilation here, and they needed to be able to slow down to stop themselves and, you know, get to the new world and everything. And unfortunately that drive, they're just going faster and faster, getting closer and closer to the speed of light. So obviously that time dilation also increases. And there's really kind of the morality of, if you were stuck in this situation where you know that for every 1 minute you're awake, a year is passing, or every, you know, week you're alive, 10 years are passing outside of the ship you're on. And I think playing with the psychological elements and how that would affect people differently was really fascinating. There were definitely some characters who I found myself connecting to with more, with that drive to want to push forward, to want to prosper and still continue and try to survive. But also on the other opposite end of that spectrum is there were people who were devastated, who really kind of lost that drive, that passion for life itself, because they didn't see any path forward. There was a lot of interesting kind of looks at how that would manifest inside of a crew. Once again, it's only 50 people, so it's not a super small group, but it is small enough where there's enough range of how people are handling things differently. And obviously this is in the bleak, you know, setting of inside of a spaceship in space. So there's not a lot of stimulus. There's not a lot going on other than some of these scientific experiments that they can still try to run and basically navigating the ship. So there's this really interesting look at what can be accomplished while all this time is passing and trying to figure out a solution to the problem. But that's also part of my biggest problem with this book, is that while some of these characters really shine, others don't, and I found some of the paths that characters went down just not nearly as interesting. And I think maybe some of it is that things just kind of happened kind of quickly for a lot of characters. They kind of went from one stage to another, and there wasn't a lot of nuance in between their feelings. Obviously, one of the big questions in this book is, should they try to continue to have children? There's a whole thing with that where I think I really felt the author's hand in there as well, which sometimes doesn't bother me, but in this one aspect, I think it really did, I don't know, it just, a lot of things happened and I'm not always sure that it flowed together super well, but at the same time, I'm still fascinated by the struggle between the people who wanted to survive and the people who didn't, and all their hopes, and like, how would people handle this kind of situation. So once again, it's just this weird of, it was the most fascinating point and also just not done well enough for me to like really grasp. I feel like because this is an older sci-fi book, that constant, I think sure you've heard the trope that old sci-fi doesn't have the same depth at character as some of the modern stuff, and that's just kind of what I felt a little bit. And it also just kind of worked this fine line of, there was still a lot of heavy science in here, and it was still very important to the story, but it wasn't like at the forefront. And the idea of time dilation and as fast as light speed travel just didn't blow my mind like this book probably would have if I have not read other more modern sci-fi that has kind of built upon these principles and ideas, and in my opinion have done them better. I don't have a good example off the top of my head, but this isn't the first time I have read or heard a story where time is moving faster outside around you. And while I doubt this is the first, but maybe it is, the classic aspect of this felt like it was just a little too bare bones and not fleshed out enough. While at the same time, the idea of the time dilation had my imagination just brimming with all kinds of different things. And it's why I'm so mixed about this book, because it's so interesting to both really be fascinated and bored at the same time, which at certain points throughout this book, I did find myself. There was not too many things in here outside of one or two characters that I could really feel myself grasp to. And there were interesting concepts that kind of made my imagination run wild, but I don't think the book itself used enough imagination to explore some of those thoughts. So it's just, once again, very interesting mixed feelings towards this book. And continuing with those mixed feelings is the ending. Now, I have made a whole video about how I think endings are overrated, how they are not necessarily the most important part of an individual book, and definitely not a series. And while I still definitely hold that belief, I do think that the ending for this book for some people will work really, really well, and for others not as much. I won't spoil what the ending is, but I think I wanted it to go one way and it went another way, and I think the way I wanted it to go would have been a much more interesting thought experiment than the way this book ended up going. And while it by no means ruined this book for me, I just think that it was once again one of those things left on the table where maybe a more modern interpretation of this same story would have been really good at exploring that other avenue, and I probably would have enjoyed it more. But in general, I think I've said this already, but I did give this a 3-star rating. I liked it. It was good. I would recommend it to people who want to explore some older sci-fi that still has some character focus. I haven't read too much older sci-fi, but the sci-fi I have read, I feel a lot of times that character depth is just lacking a little bit, but I do think this one did it better than some of the other older sci-fi I have read. But that is all I have to say about the Tau Zero. If you have read this, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. If you haven't read this, let me know if you plan on, or if you have any questions, let me know. And as always, have a good one.